There was once a time when the United States led the world in the percentage of our people who had college degrees. Once a time when we had the strongest public school system in the world. Once a time when we had strong child care. And believe it or not, once a time where young people went to outstanding colleges that were tuition free. Do you all know that? And our job is to make it clear that just like health care, education from child care to graduate school to trade school is a human right.
At 12 degrees below zero, the world doesn't feel quiet. It feels sealed. Snow absorbs sound. Cold hardens everything it touches. In the wealthy suburbs outside Minneapolis, the streets were pitch black beneath 2 feet of fresh snowfall, and the houses looked like postcards. Warm lights behind thick windows, clean driveways, perfect lawns buried under white. It was the last place anyone would imagine as a command post for something violent and sprawling. And then, at 4:47 a.m., the silence broke, not with shouting, not with sirens, but with the low mechanical hum of an armored vehicle idling at the curb, the kind of sound you only notice when the rest of the world is still. In the shadows behind it, a line of federal agents moved with controlled urgency, boots crunching softly in the snow, breath fogging in the air. They carried a warrant. They carried a plan. They carried the weight of an investigation that had stopped being a case file a long time ago. Inside a 7-bedroom mansion on a quiet cul-de-sac, a 67-year-old man known to his neighbors as a success story sat awake in a living room that smelled faintly of incense and polished wood. He had built a reputation over 2 decades. He ran popular local restaurants. He posed for photos at ribbon cuttings and charity events. His mantle held smiling pictures with officials and community leaders. He was the kind of person people described as good for the city. When he heard the boots outside, he didn't run. He didn't scramble for a hidden drawer. He didn't shout for anyone to protect him. He simply waited. Seconds later, the front door splintered under a hydraulic breach. Flashlights flooded the foyer. "Federal warrant!" a voice shouted, sharp enough to cut through the cold. Agents poured into the home in a wave, fast, disciplined, methodical. The aggression looked out of place in a house like this. They weren't hunting street dealers in alleys. They were hunting something that had learned to wear a suit, host fundraisers, and blend into civic life. In the living room, the man rose slowly and met the lead agent's eyes with a strange calm. In perfect, dignified English, he said something that sounded less like fear and more like confirmation. "I've been expecting you." He was taken into custody without a fight. But the true fight, what the investigation was really about, had never been at the front door. It was in the walls. As agents began to search, the house revealed its second identity. Behind hollow drywall, they found stacks of vacuum-sealed cash, packed and layered as if the home itself had been turned into a vault. Under floorboards in an attic space, they recovered notebooks, ledgers written in multiple languages, the kind of records people keep when they're trying to control an enterprise that can't be allowed to drift. But the most chilling discovery wasn't the money. It was a set of files, employee records tied to a local youth program, names, contacts, schedules, a clean, organized administrative system that, at first glance, looked like ordinary nonprofit paperwork. Except it wasn't describing volunteers and after-school activities. It was describing recruitment, quietly identifying young people who could be used as couriers without understanding what they were carrying. A pipeline hidden inside the kind of institution people are taught to trust. That's when the case stopped being a bust. It became a story about betrayal. The operation was called Operation Broken Trust, and the name wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Investigators didn't just want evidence. They wanted to shatter a shield, because this network didn't survive through intimidation and chaos the way many drug rings do. It survived through respectability, through social armor, through the fact that anyone who asked uncomfortable questions could be accused of bias, paranoia, or hate. According to the file, the targets were not a crew of tattooed strangers. They were a tightly connected group that presented itself as the peak of the American dream. Successful businesses, polished public reputations, community-facing organizations, and ties to civic life. Their outward image wasn't a mask on top of crime. It was a tool of crime. They ran the operation like a corporation. Logistics, human resources, accounting, marketing. The product didn't move through street corners. It moved through kitchens after hours, through storage rooms behind sports equipment, through back offices of legitimate storefronts. The youth center, where kids were supposed to find mentors, functioned in this narrative as a distribution hub. The restaurants weren't only places people ate, they were places where packaging could happen out of sight. A nonprofit that spoke the language of empowerment served another role entirely. Money moved through it, washed clean by the social assumptions that charities don't need to be questioned. And because the cover was so strong, local enforcement couldn't reach the core. There were no easy weak links, no low-level dealer to flip, no single phone call that collapsed the whole operation. If anything, the case shows how networks like this harden themselves by replacing criminal instability with organizational discipline. So how did it unravel? Not through a snitch, through a machine. 19 months before the raid, thousands of miles away, customs officers at a major U.S. port were scanning cargo that seemed boring on purpose, spices and textiles. The manifest looked clean. The paperwork was professional. The shipment wasn't even flagged as high risk. But on the screen, one pallet behaved like a lie. A density scanner saw an anomaly that didn't match organic material. Spices have predictable density signatures. This pallet was too heavy, too uniform, too wrong. Officers cut open vacuum-sealed bags of cumin and found buried beneath the aromatic surface a hidden payload: fentanyl powder. It was the kind of discovery that changes an investigation's temperature instantly. Fentanyl isn't just another drug. It's small, potent, and unforgiving. It doesn't need a big pipeline to ruin lives. It needs a tiny one. Agents questioned an importer associated with the shipment. He performed innocence perfectly, producing invoices, emails, and plausible explanations. He described himself as a victim of supplier corruption. The paperwork was flawless, and for a moment, the case went quiet. Not because investigators were convinced, but because the standard burden of proof couldn't bridge the gap between suspicion and charges. The file suggests one agent refused to close the folder. She believed the port incident wasn't random. She believed it was a test, an early thread in a much larger tapestry. While investigators followed shipping records and financial trails, something else was already happening back in Minnesota. Poison was seeping into real lives, where paperwork can't explain it away. In mid-January 2025, a teenager arrived at an emergency room and collapsed. Doctors fought for minutes that felt like hours. Toxicology results suggested an exposure far beyond what anyone would consider accidental. She survived, but survival came with information. When she was able to speak, she named someone she believed she could trust, a youth worker connected to the community center. That detail mattered because it wasn't just tragedy. It was linkage. A detective pulled the youth worker's records. On paper, an ordinary employee with an ordinary salary. In the bank, cash deposits that didn't match reality. In the phone logs, hundreds of calls tied to the importer's business. In that moment, the loop closed. A person positioned as a mentor was also a distributor. A businessman positioned as a community pillar was also a supplier. And the most terrifying part wasn't how complicated it was how complete it was. Investigators seized financial records across the associated businesses. Forensic accountants rebuilt the money like archaeologists reconstructing a skeleton. The numbers didn't just suggest fraud, they suggested a parallel economy. Funds moved through shell companies and foreign transfers, then reappeared as real estate purchases, donations, and operating budgets that gave the whole enterprise the appearance of legitimate prosperity. Step by step, the story described a closed loop. Import through legitimate commerce. Process in an industrial space disguised as storage, press pills at scale, package them within trusted businesses, distribute through respected community-facing institutions, then launder profits through nonprofits and property. A machine that turned trust into cover, But as investigators reviewed encrypted communications, they saw something colder than greed. Expansion, references to routes beyond Minnesota, mentions of other cities, indications that this wasn't a standalone operation but one node in a wider model. That forced a strategic decision. If they only hit one house, the network would adapt. If they only arrested a few people, the pipeline would reroute. The operation had to be simultaneous. It had to be precise. It had to be overwhelming enough that the people on the other end couldn't press the button that deletes a digital life. Federal prosecutors authorized dozens of warrants. The strike time was set for the early morning, when people are slow, when phones are quiet, when coordination is hardest. The plan targeted everything at once: the mansion, the warehouse, the restaurants, the non-profit offices, and the youth center. At 5 a.m., the second hand passed the 12. Execute. Across Minneapolis and St. Paul, teams moved in sync. Doors were breached. Offices were secured. Evidence was frozen in place. At an industrial site tied to the importer, agents cut through reinforced doors expecting paperwork and shipments. Instead, the file describes a death factory. Pill presses, white dust in the air, raw powder staged for processing, counterfeit pills stamped to mimic familiar medications. At the youth center, the operation was delicate because the location itself carried emotional weight. It was a place where children played soccer and received tutoring. Yet behind locked storage rooms, investigators found the hidden truth: cash stashed beneath legitimate supplies, pills concealed under the surface of normal life. A youth worker surrendered in tears, handcuffed against the same lockers where he once coached kids. At the family restaurants, agents searched walk-in freezers and back offices. Behind containers labeled as food, they recovered money and narcotics staged for distribution. At non-profit offices, servers and records were seized. Paper trails that could prove how money had been cleaned and moved. By late morning, the file describes an astonishing total: roughly 1 million fentanyl pills removed from circulation, tens of millions in cash seized, and multiple members of the network taken into custody. The specific numbers are presented in the file as headline scale, built for impact. But the narrative's core point is the same. The operation wasn't about a single stash. It was about dismantling an ecosystem. And then came the part that doesn't fit cleanly into an action narrative: the cost. Investigators linked chemical signatures to overdose cases, suggesting a multi-year trail of harm. Court proceedings followed, with prosecutors relying on ledgers, witnesses, and testimony from people impacted by the product. A survivor described the betrayal plainly. She trusted a place that promised safety, and that trust was used against her. Verdicts came. Sentences were severe. The public saw the fall of a network that had looked untouchable. But victory didn't feel clean, because the story didn't end with one courtroom. The file claims officials warned that the model extended beyond one state. Other groups, other routes, other pipelines using the same camouflage, legitimate businesses, community institutions, nonprofits, and the assumption that respectability equals innocence. And that is where the story should end. Not in paranoia, not in scapegoating, not in a demand that people distrust each other, but in one hard, necessary question. If a network can hide inside the most trusted structures, if it can use community language as a shield and paperwork as a disguise, then what does accountability look like without destroying trust itself? How do we audit systems without turning into suspicion machines? How do we protect children without weaponizing fear? And how do we learn to ask the right questions early, before the next winter morning, before the next 4:47 a.m. hum outside a quiet house, before trust becomes the easiest tool a criminal enterprise can use?